The story that we are going to get you right now is a story that most employees would want to see, and it is a story that most employees, most bosses of those employees would rather not see. There is a latest book, and this is the book which is in my hand right now. It's just out. It's called The Company We Keep, written by Divya Khanna. It talks about a very interesting concept called the corporate caste system. In fact, that is the very first chapter. This book reveals on whether there is a need to manage your boss. As I told you, something every employee wants their boss to hear, and perhaps something which bosses do not want discussed. It makes them uncomfortable. It gives you a key insight as to how the corporate culture in this country particularly is a little divided. What is the problem and what could perhaps be the possible solutions? Joining us right now is the author of this book, Divya Khanna. Divya, thank you very much. It's very clear that there will be great amount of interest in what you have written in here. Would you like to tell our viewers that when you start with the first chapter that reads the corporate caste system, and we managed to get some excerpts of what people told you, the research that you did, and through the course of that research, what people told you, some very interesting points came out. What can one expect from a book like this?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me and for paying attention to my book. I think what people can expect from this book is a little bit of information. I have done qualitative research, so this is not just my opinion, and this is not a rant of a burnt out person, which is what I was when I started this project. This is actually based on research, qualitative research from people in the corporate sector. And this is something which is actually very well known. That, we want to, there's a very common said that, people don't leave companies, they leave bosses. The truth is people also don't stick to companies, they stick to good bosses. So, there is this thing of being on the good side of the boss, and that comes from our cultural status consciousness that is already embedded in us. We always want to kind of give proper respect and deference to the people we consider to be of a higher status. And we are not so mindful in our interactions with people of a lower status. And that is what gets reflected in the corporate hierarchy as well. Whether the boss is a traditional command and control and dominating boss or not, it's the employees who, their association, which authority that interacts with that, Somewhere we fear kind of giving offense to our bosses. So sometimes we may not deliver bad news, or we may kind of, water it down because we are afraid of, that, the messenger might be killed because of the bad message. And that's a fear which even bosses have, because bosses also have bosses. So you will see in my book, if you read later on in the chapters, that even the bosses are more focused on managing their own bosses, and they don't really see themselves in the same light.
Yeah, Ms. Khanna, you see some very key insights in the paragraphs that we picked up from the book. One was on, of course, this is a quote. You've spoken to someone and they say, managing the boss is a critical aspect of our careers, and we believe that it largely determines whether we are headed for the ladders or the snakes. Because if you manage the boss well, you will climb the ladders. And if you don't, then you will be bitten by the snake. Do you think that this is a very, very real fear? And now having, this may be the story of every employee, but what does one do beyond this? You hit a dead end. I mean, this is the system one has to follow.
Yeah, so it's not, I think the point that my book is trying to make is that this system is not very, very rigid. It's largely in our heads, and it's largely made by ourselves. It's an internal fear. We think, everything we're living in the range of our boss will give the final performance appraisal, which will finally get us that promotion or that increment, or might not get us those opportunities. And, so the worry is that, I always have to stay on his good side. He should never see me vulnerable. I should never go to him with my problems. Yet there are some bosses who would appreciate being told if there's a problem way before, because, it's like the story of the emperor's new clothes, right? The boss doesn't want to be shown up as naked in front of everybody. He doesn't, if there's a big mistake, he is going to be the face of it. So he would appreciate clarity and honesty from his team members when a problem exists, so that fear of, that, and also the younger generation is not so much in awe of authority, and they would like to kind of, be more assertive. So I think it's an evolving culture, and I think it's up to us how it evolves.
Divya Khanna, do you feel that you have, in a way, stated the obvious, what many people already know? Because beyond that, for instance, there's a very interesting thing that you mentioned in the book, which is called corporate hierarchy in India is stronger because of the cultural bias towards hierarchy in the Indian society. So what you see in the society is what you see in the corporate culture. Now my next question will be, whose responsibility is it to insulate the corporate culture from the biases in the society?
Yes, so I think you're absolutely right. This is coming from Indian society into corporate culture, but it's also Indian society is also kind of evolving, right? So the easiest thing is to take the example of parents and their children. How our parents interacted with our grandparents is very different from the way we interact with our parents, and it's even more different when it comes to our children interacting with us. So over time, those, distance of authority is kind of loosening up a bit. And it's basically the change in the parenting styles. So, similarly in corporate culture also, it has been evolving, and there are companies which are trying to be more egalitarian. So one of the examples is when my father would have started work, he would have always addressed his boss as Mr. So-and-so. And from the day that I started my boss, I always addressed all my bosses and clients with their first name. So that kind of does reduce the distance a little bit. So it is really about us. If we understand that this is happening, and you're also absolutely right about the fact that I'm stating the obvious. The fact is that these are conversations we have only with our very, very intimate circles. If we bring this conversation into the open with our bosses, with our team members, with our companies, perhaps then we can, tackle these issues much more constructively.
Divya, one of the things that you mentioned in the beginning is that a lot of this fear is a construct in the mind of an employee rather than the employer or, to quote from this book, the boss. But the point is, whose responsibility is it to make sure that those fears do not exist or to allay those fears? So by this logic, a boss can easily turn around and say, how do I help it if somebody is not coming to me?
Yeah, so I think it is about being mindful. This whole book is not about assigning blame to anybody. It's not anybody's particular fault, and therefore it's not anybody's particular responsibility to correct it. It's something that we are all perpetuating. So it's about being mindful and introspective and saying that, for example, I had a boss who, she kept giving me feedback and I just didn't understand what she was saying. And eventually I was so scared of, constantly asking for clarification. I just did, word for word, I just copied what she said. And that also didn't go down well, right? So that was my, this thing. Had I been more assertive, I might have been able to understand better, and the fact is that there is a pressure of time, so that's the other issue that my book talks about, is that we are kind of working in this pressure cooker where everything is very, very short term. There's intense pressure on delivering short term results. So we don't have time to think things through, that pressure, like deliver it now, do it tonight, do it over the weekend. And we are constantly working in that kind of an environment. So, even for bosses to kind of, create a safe environment for their team members, they also need a little time to reflect and introspect. And I think if we slow down slightly, I'm not saying that obviously, business pressure will be there, but if we can kind of make room for reflection and introspection and having these important conversations, I think we can create, it's a teamwork effort. It's
through
not
the course of your research, Divya Khanna, did you come across situations where, you felt that usually or in most cases, this stems out of the boss's own insecurity about his or her achievements. And that gets passed on. For instance, there was a quote in this book that says, stress always flows downward.
Yes. So this is absolutely true. But also what happens is that, how secure a person is, it depends on that person, not necessarily on the immediate boss. In the last section of my book, I actually have chapters written by experts in psychotherapy, in management, in HR, and in workspace design. And I would encourage everybody, especially, to read the chapter on psychotherapy from a therapeutic point of view. And it talks about, how when you feel insecure, you feel scared, your brain is basically hijacked and it goes to the lower evolved brain. So you're actually in that mode of fight or flight or freeze, whereas, all our higher powers of objectivity, rationality, of behaving reasonably are in the neocortex of the brain. So, it's a question of creating that psychological safety inside ourselves as well as extending it to the people around us. So, there are, for example, I have also had bosses who might have been a bit insecure, but I've always seen that team members handle them differently. So there are people who are good at handling those kind of bosses and they don't take that stress on themselves. And then there are people who crumble under that stress.
Yeah. Yeah. My final question, of course, there is we can go on and on. There's like,
Sure.
for instance, a chapter called Jugaad at Work. But, we all understand what this is. So we're going to give this a miss. My final question, through the course of your research for this book, did you ever come across something like a revolving feedback, a 360-degree feedback that, a boss is always, out of a sense of entitlement and also responsibility supposed to judge an employee? How about the employees judging these bosses back?
Yeah, so a lot of companies actually do have 360-degree feedback. And so those kind of performance systems do exist. But sometimes employees are a little worried, so it depends on, how your perception of the corporate environment and of your bosses, Sometimes people would hesitate to say anything too negative and sometimes they would kind of, not say anything negative at all. But I believe that there are HR policies and HR experts who are working on this, on trying to make the feedback system much more fair and effective that way.
How honest were people when they were speaking to you?
I would say they were quite honest because they were assured of anonymity. They knew I was not representing any organization and, I had assured them. In fact, I signed an NDA with them so that, they knew that I would not disclose their details. And I think these are things we're dying to talk about, right?
How many hate messages have you got from your previous bosses?
None, actually. In fact, they've been quite supportive. And, I realized, even if at some point I might have kind of held something against them, I realized it was more me than them. So, it's not
nice.
It's not a question of them being responsible of anything. Like I said, this is a collective responsibility. And if we individually take ownership of our share, then we can build a better system.
Divya Khanna, thank you very much. Let's hope people pick up this book and maybe relive their own story as they read your experiences. Right. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.